Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amounts given in the link in the description box. But the least you can do is to like this show and watch this show. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest today, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin is an expert on West Asia. Mouin, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with your program again.
Maybe as we speak, we are hearing reports about the Iranian retaliation in the Al Udeid air base in Qatar. Largely, the New York Times, the Bloombergs, and others have reported that it's a symbolic retaliation. I wonder how you are reading this.
Can we stop for a second?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I'm sorry because there's this rattling noise. I have to
Okay,
get
okay,
up for a
okay. Fix
second.
that.
Yeah.
Yes, yes,
Were you able
yes.
to hear it? The rattling?
I'm afraid I don't hear it.
Good. Okay.
Hmm.
Hope that gets rid of it.
Yep.
Okay, sorry. Do you want to start over or should I answer your
No,
question?
you can just start. We'll edit it out.
Okay. Well, yes, Iran has now launched a missile attack on Al Udeid air base in Qatar. It's the largest U.S. Air Force base in the Middle East, and I believe also functions as the regional headquarters of Central Command. What we know is that the U.S. Evacuated or largely evacuated this Air Force base already several days ago. And there are now also reports that the Iranians informed the Qataris of this attack ahead of time. And so that would lead one to conclude that this was intended as a symbolic attack by the Iranians, in which they sought to avoid inflicting U.S. casualties. And we now have to see what happens next. Do the Iranians consider this the extent of their retaliation to the massive U.S. Air Force bombing raid on Iran? Are they going to basically declare victory and go home? And equally importantly, how is the US going to respond? Is it going to say these were basically harmless fireworks and leave it at that? Or will they make good on their threat that if Iran responded in any way, it would be attacked even more fiercely by the United States? So there's a lot of unanswered questions because we don't know whether for the Iranians this they consider this to be their response or the beginning of the response, and we don't know if the Americans are basically willing to look the other way and kind of dismiss this as a harmless pinprick, or whether they will use it as a pretext to launch further attacks from Iran. Now, we're very much focused on the US-Iranian relationship, but I think it's also important to note that this attack, of course, took place on Qatari territory, and Qatar is the least hostile Gulf state to Iran. So, did the Iranians choose Qatar not only because of the size of the US base that they attacked, but also because they feel that Qatar, for example, in comparison with Saudi Arabia or the UAE, and despite the fierce Qatari condemnation of the Iranian attack, are not going to get actively involved themselves, and was part of the message the Iranians are hoping to send is to increase pressure on not only Qatar, but on the Gulf states as a whole to use their influence with Washington to put an end to the Israeli war on Iran, because, as this attack demonstrates, the consequences for these Gulf states are coming increasingly closer to home. So, we're talking about a development that took place just an hour or so before we started speaking. And I would say its significance is yet to be determined because there are a lot of unanswered questions about motives, about next steps, and about potential responses.
Something I found interesting in the Tehran Times was that they mentioned that Iran has launched this retaliation as Prime Minister Abbas Araghchi is in
The
Moscow.
foreign minister.
Excuse me. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi is in Moscow, and I think that's a there is a lot there to unpack about what the Russians must be signaling to the Iranians. Of course, as you said, it would depend, eventually, it would depend on how the US responds to this, because the Iranians have definitely been extremely cautious about not dragging the United States into this war. What's my own sense is that Russia must have said that we would be prepared in the event that if the United States goes on and on with their criminal action, given the strike has come, as I said, when Abbas Araghchi is in Moscow. What's your sense of Russian willingness to participate in this conflict, given the Western media, New York Times in particular, but Bloomberg's and so on, have been writing articles after articles saying that the Russians look the other way around as their friend has been pummeled by Israel in the United States.
Well, one persistent challenge faced by Israel's adversaries in the region, certainly Iran today, um, and a variety of Arab states previously, Egypt and Syria in the 1960s and 70s and so on, is that their geopolitical allies' commitment to them has always been significantly less than the Western commitment to Israel. So we saw, for example, in the early 1970s, that the United States was delivering all kinds of advanced, sophisticated weapons to Israel, while the Soviet Union would not match weapons deliveries to its Arab clients and partners, primarily Egypt and Syria, with anything approaching the same levels. Now, regarding your specific question, I would make several observations. First of all, as you know, Russia has its hands more than full with a war of its own. Its war in Ukraine, and secondly, it is seeking to establish a constructive working relationship with the United States in order to meet its objectives in Ukraine. And thirdly, in the broader, let's say, geopolitical dynamics, it probably doesn't mind the United States getting bogged down in the Middle East and having less power and resources and so on to devote to any containment of Russia. At the same time, Russia also has good relations with Israel. So that, we're not talking about the Cold War in which superpowers are aligned with either one or the other local party. Russia has close relations with Iran, but it also maintains good relations with Israel. And I suspect that Russia will be urging restraint on Iran, but may also be communicating to Iran that there are certain red lines beyond which Russia will not tolerate Israeli behavior, and that there are certain red lines which, if crossed by Iran, will not receive support from Russia. And here we can go back really to the past decade, where you had significant Iranian forces in Syria, and you had advanced Russian anti-aircraft capabilities in Syria, and these were never deployed to defend Iranian assets in Syria from regular, almost routine attacks by the Israeli Air Force. So I think we should avoid taking a simplistic view of this, where we see two opposing camps aligned with two opposing superpowers, because there's a whole, in contrast to the Cold War, there's a whole web of relationships that are at play. Would even a concerted U.S. effort in conjunction with Israel to produce regime change in Tehran, would that elicit a forceful Russian response? I'm not so sure that would be the case, because on the one hand, yes, the Russians would lose an important ally, especially, of course, after the ouster of the Assad regime in Syria, but they will also be looking at it perhaps as an opportunity to sap the strength of the US as it gets bogged down into another prolonged conflict in the Middle East.
Yeah, that's a point that has been confusing me, and I'm sure it cannot be resolved. And it's been also spoken about China, that China might not dislike, because given its the Pacific Command has been partly and significantly moved to the Central Command, effectively from the pivot back from East Asia to West Asia. And that would mean that China would see some relief. On the other hand, of course, both China and Russia would also be nervous, given the United States is expanding and collapsing an international world order where at least there used to be some sanity, even though that wasn't fair. I think um, since so much of it is hinged on how the United States would go forward, I would be curious to hear from you. What was your analysis about what made the United States to bomb Natanz, Isfahan, and Fido?
Yeah. Well, before answering that question, I just want to say a word about China, because I don't think China and Russia are quite in the same boat. The key difference, of course, is that Russia is actively involved in a war, and additionally, Russia is the world's largest oil producer and is able to satisfy its domestic market without relying on any imports. China, by contrast, imports most of its energy supplies from the Persian Gulf region, and so will be quite concerned about further escalation of this conflict, and particularly potential closure of the Straits of Hormuz and of the Bab el Mandeb Strait, which would have a severe impact on Chinese energy imports, and B, have a severe impact on Chinese trade in other goods, particularly with Europe. So, on the one hand, I think China arguably has more of a interest in rapid de-escalation than does Russia. But at the same time, you could also make the argument that China has a closer relationship with Iran than does Russia. They recently signed this strategic partnership and so on. And
Russia,
China,
Russia.
no, China did. No, China and Iran did. I believe last year. And another difference is that China, I think, sees itself as much more threatened by the U.S. than does Russia. So they will be looking at U.S. policy in Iran almost as a harbinger of how the U.S. could then try to contain and weaken China and so on. At the same time, China not only signed a strategic relationship with Iran, it also brokered the normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Because here again, you have a global power that is not aligned with one state in the Middle East, but has multiple alliances. And Saudi Arabia is a key partner for China as well, particularly in terms of energy imports. The United Arab Emirates is a key source of Chinese investment and non-oil trade in terms of imports of Chinese products and so on, as are many of these other states. So here again, you can make a very strong case about why China would use its influence to prevent further escalation of this war, but at the same time that China may be more sensitive to any dramatic moves by the United States to intervene in Iran than perhaps Russia would. Now, to get to your question, just to put it in context, I think ultimately you have to believe one of two things. You either believe that the Trump administration entered office in January of this year determined to resume and intensify the policy of maximum pressure that it instituted during the first Trump administration and was hell bent on a military confrontation with Iran. In other words, what we're seeing now was a plan all along. This whole diplomatic engagement and negotiations was nothing more than perfidy, deceit, a ruse to lull the Iranians into a false sense of security while a military attack was being prepared against them in coordination with Israel. The alternative explanation, and the one I find more credible, to be frank, is that there was a fundamental difference in the region when the second Trump administration came into office compared to 2017. Back then, you had a very close alignment between the United States, Israel, and the conservative Arab states with respect to Iran policy. All wanted to see the Iran nuclear agreement renounced and abrogated. All wanted to see Iran weakened and further isolated. They were all enthusiastic proponents of the policy of maximum pressure, and all ideally also wanted to see regime change in Tehran. What happened in the interim is that particularly the conservative Arab states came to the conclusion that the costs of the policies they were supporting were prohibitively expensive. They far outweighed the benefits, and that in any military confrontation, they would be in the front line and would pay an exorbitant price. And this was a lesson gained in part because of growing Houthi missile and drone attacks from Yemen into Saudi Arabia and also into the United Arab Emirates, and the Iranian sophisticated drone and missile attack on the absolutely vital Aramco facilities in eastern Saudi Arabia. So while everyone was talking about the importance of these of Arab states normalizing relations with Israel, what you in fact saw was Saudi Arabia, preceded by the UAE, normalizing relations, restoring diplomatic relations, and so on with Iran, not out of love for each other, but because it best served their interests. And when Trump came into office, they were in fact encouraging the United States to pursue diplomacy rather than military conflict with Iran. And my own view is that when Trump announced, or when he sent his letter to the Iranian Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and then announced negotiations with Iran, with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu sitting dutifully by his side, I believe the Americans were serious, that the Americans genuinely wanted to seriously explore the possibility of a diplomatic resolution of their differences, their conflict, if you will, with Iran. And I believe the Iranians were equally serious about engagement. And what made the Iranians serious this time, or rather the reason the Iranians felt that it was appropriate to take the Americans seriously after these same Americans, Trump, had unilaterally renounced and rejected the Iranian nuclear agreement and left the impression that he was an entirely untrustworthy individual, was at this time the Americans put the lifting of primary sanctions on the table, and that was absolutely vital for the Iranians. And secondly, that the Americans also made clear that their red line was that Iran would not and could never have a nuclear weapon. And that was an American demand that the Iranians were prepared to accept. For the Iranians, the red line was that they would not renounce the rights they already had under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to enrich uranium to low levels for exclusively civilian purposes on their own territory. And between these two red lines, it seemed we were increasingly moving towards convergence. What then happened, in my view, is that you had a coalition of Israel's loyalists in the US administration, in the US Congress, in the US media, and more broadly in the US, and anti Iran war hawks in the United States. This coalition came together and successfully persuaded Trump and his envoy, effectively his Secretary of State, Steve Witkoff, neither of whom are particularly intelligent minds, neither of whom have a particularly sophisticated understanding of the Middle East, and neither of whom know virtually anything about Iran and its history and its politics. Trump and Witkoff were persuaded by this coalition that it was a realistic objective to demand that Iran renounce its rights under the NPT. In other words, to demand that Iran accept not to enrich any uranium, even at very low levels of enrichment for exclusively civilian purposes on its territory. This was sold to them as a realistic objective. The Iranians, of course, rejected this out of hand and basically accused the US of moving the goalposts and putting forth unrealistic demands. But they continued negotiating. And then the same coalition, in my view, successfully persuaded Trump that that an Israeli military attack on Iran, which in its opening stages would be very similar to the decapitation strike, would be very similar to the decapitation strike that Israel launched against Hezbollah in Lebanon last year, that if the US endorsed such an attack, it would dramatically weaken Iran. It would bring Iran to its knees, and the US would then have extraordinary leverage over Iran in negotiations and could basically force the Iranians to accept whatever the US wanted. And so the Israeli war on Iran was sold to the US not as a war for regime change, but as a negotiating tactic and a short, sharp, successful strike that would dramatically improve the US's negotiating positions. And Trump fell into the trap. Again, we're not exactly dealing with a stable genius here. And I think more recently, the same coalition managed to persuade Trump that he needed to get involved because one massive US airstrike on these three Iranian nuclear facilities, one and done, we kept hearing, would basically uh, end Iranian resistance. And that if Trump did not do it, he would look weak and so on. And you had even the Democratic leadership accosting Trump for being weak against Iran. And when you're dealing, with arguably the world's most accomplished narcissist, accusing him of weakness is not something that he wants to hear. And so my view is that this coalition had war with Iran on its agenda from the very outset. Let's not forget, in the beginning, they kept talking about the so-called Libyan scenario. Um, uh, they had war with Iran on their agenda from the very outset. And once war became a realistic option, its objectives were always regime change, at least, and state collapse, ideally. But by selling these various measures to Trump as measures not that would lead the U.S. inevitably into a prolonged military conflict in the Middle East a la Iraq, but as short, sharp, successful initiatives that would improve Washington's negotiating position and lead to the negotiated resolution that Trump claimed to want. I think that's how they succeeded.
Now, though, the talks are off, and that brings the question of what is a way out? Because if if the Americans have been thinking that on one hand we'd be bombing and on the other hand we'd be using that as a pressure tactic to bully them into giving up their right to enrichment for peaceful purposes, and then we can perhaps even expand that into giving up ballistic missiles and so on, as the Europeans are saying. um, if the talks are closed effectively, what is the way out? Because I don't see the Europeans can be negotiators. They are repeating the nonsense ad nauseum. Um, Russians would not be accepted by the Americans. And the Iranians are clear that as long as the bombings don't stop, we won't talk. And even if the Americans stop the bombings, it seems to me that the Israelis are in no mood of doing that. Throughout today, they have been expanding their bombing everywhere. So what that means is that we are in a very dangerous situation.
Yes, that's exactly where we are, and the stakes have been raised. I mean, the Israelis and their allies in Washington have Trump exactly where they want him. The U.S. demand now is not only total dismantlement of the entire Iranian nuclear program, but also total dismantlement of the entire Iranian ballistic missile program. Basically, total dismantlement of anything Iran could ever use to not only to attack anyone else, but also to defend itself from an Israeli or U.S. attack in the future. And this, of course, is a non-starter for Iran, not because they're religious fanatics and because they're Shiites and because they're Ayatollahs and because of all the other absurd reasons we're hearing, but because um, no state, no regime in its right mind is ever going to accept being on its knees before a regional and global hegemon. Now, you could make the argument that if the US came to its senses, ordered Israel to stop its attack and sent messages to the Iranians that it accepts Iran's rights that it has under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that this could set the stage for a eventual resumption of negotiations and an agreement. It's a very nice idea, and I believe it would be successful, but I think we've reached a stage where it's wishful thinking. I think regime change is in Iran is increasingly setting the tone of the discussion by Israel and its allies, and therefore we're likely to see continued escalation. I think the Russians, given that they have good relations with both the Iranians and the Israelis, and Putin has been speaking with both the Iranians and the Israelis, and of course with the Americans, they could play this role of mediators, But the Iranians have said there will be no negotiations prior to an end of Israeli attacks on Iranian territory. No negotiations doesn't mean no talks about how to end the conflict, as opposed to negotiations about a new agreement. But again, my own view is we're past that point because the Israelis now have regime change in their sights and are not going to let go. And I think it's important also to bear in mind Israel's motivations for this war. Israel is the region's only nuclear power, and in significant part launched this war in order to preserve its monopoly on the possession of nuclear weapons in the Middle East. Um, Another important reason that Israel went to war was because it views Iran as the head of the octopus, as it puts it, of the axis of resistance, and believes that its efforts to degrade and destroy the axis of resistance, the various tentacles, as Israelis put it, Hamas, Hezbollah, and so on, will not be complete unless it crushes the head of this axis in Iran. And so for Israel to end this military campaign, before it succeeds in those objectives, will be seen by the Israelis as a defeat, as a failure to implement their new security doctrine, which is not just to deter adversaries through the possession of overwhelming force, but to deploy that overwhelming force to eliminate any real or potential or emerging threat to their national security. So I don't think the Israelis can stop. Of course, it would take no more than a phone call from Washington for them to stop. But under the current circumstances, I don't see that phone call coming. Also, because Israel and its loyalists and the hawks in the US keep pushing this message to Trump, that if you stop, you will be made to look weak. People will make fun of you. You're basically talking about a little kid who doesn't want to be mocked by his classmates.
Would the MAGA movement be of any significance in terms of pressurizing Trump not to escalate further and further, or was it just a show anyway and would have already capitulated?
No, I think it's a very good question because, interestingly, in the run-up to this war, the most significant opposition came not from the left, came certainly not from the leadership of the Democratic Party, but came from within the MAGA camp. Names I don't really know, but I'm sure you've seen it as well. There's a virtual civil war within the Republican Party, within the MAGA movement about this, because there's a very clear split between the non-interventionists and the interventionists. As far as the left is concerned, yes, they may be very principled in their opposition to illegal foreign wars, but their influence in the U.S. certainly is extremely marginal and limited. I think the problem with the opposition to this war from within the Republican Party and the MAGA movement is that Trump has transformed the Republican Party into a personality cult. And when you're dealing with a personality cult, people may be opposed to a decision that the cult's leader has not taken. But once that decision has been taken, it becomes much more difficult to continue opposing that decision because then you're basically questioning the sacredness of the cult's leader. So my suspicion, and I'm only speculating, is that the influence of anti-war voices within the Republican MAGA cult is going to be significantly diminished now that Trump has actually taken the decision to go to war, because you're no longer opposing war, you're opposing God. In other words, Trump.
Yes, we've already seen voices like Steve Bannon and even Tucker Carlson to some extent have capitulated. Steve Bannon said that if President Trump can tell us that there is a justification for this bombing, then we will support. But as long as we don't see the justification, we will oppose it. And I think that's my main critique of the MAGA movement when it comes to war. I mean, of course, they are terrible
They're
at
not
other
opposed
things.
in principle.
Yeah, exactly. So the argument is that as long as it is not in the American interest, we oppose it. But what if it is in the American interest? I mean, the idea of war cannot be reduced to this principle that it is not in the interest of one nation. It
But
should
but
be
sorry
about.
to interrupt you, but sorry to interrupt, but that's what the MAGA movement is, America first. And therefore, much of the opposition to this war has been, we voted for America first. Why are we now putting Israel first and putting Israel's interests ahead of America's at the cost of American blood and treasure? And so, therefore, much will also depend on what happens. Will Trump be vindicated in his claims that he has completely obliterated the Iranian nuclear program, that the Iranians won't dare retaliate against the U.S., and that if they do, Iran will be obliterated along with their nuclear program, or will we see a gradual descent into a regional war and so on? All those things, I think, it's too early to tell. But the other point, of course, is that one skill that Trump does excel in is he is a world-class, highly accomplished demagogue. So all these people, Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon, and whoever else, they don't stand a chance against him once
Absolutely.
he puts them in their sights. I mean, look at what happened to Tulsi Gabbard. One snap from Trump, and she changed every one of her opinions in the space of, I think, 6.5 hours. She is now, no one on earth is more convinced that Iran already possesses nuclear weapons than Tulsi Gabbard. Why? Because she got a call from the personality cult.
And we should not forget J.D. Vance in the leaked cable, where he
Yes,
was opposing the bombing of Yemen, but
precisely.
the next day he says, "I'm fine."
Yeah,
Um, yeah, just to make one more point here is that it's also important to emphasize that things like whether a war is in American interest or not is an extremely ambiguous thing. It's not like 2 plus 2 is 4, because the Lindsey Grahams and all the neocons, the Zionist lobby, they can they can make the same argument that this is in the interest of the United States. So
exactly.
so the
Yeah,
principles are not challenged, and that's where you see that the libertarians instead are relatively more consistent. The Scott Hortons or Dave Smith and others, because at least they have a principled opposition to war.
mm,
And so they've
yeah,
been able to maintain their consistency. But the MAGA movement is extremely weak because their foundation is very shaky. And one can make that argument that it is in our interest. Um, okay, I think
yeah. If I can
yes,
just make one point
sure.
about that, I fully agree with you. And of course, the national interest is in the eye of the beholder.
Hmm.
And what I may consider absolutely vital for the national interest, you may feel equally strongly would mortally endanger the national interest. And the other point I would make is if the national interest, as interpreted by you or me or whoever, is a legitimate justification for going to war, that means any state, any movement who decides that they have a legitimate national interest to go to war can take that decision and implement it
Absolutely.
without any regard to the norms and rules that are supposed to regulate these things.
That is precisely why the same mega movement is so convinced about the war on immigrations,
Yes.
because that is also effectively couched in the same language. It's national
Mm,
security, it's national threat. We are facing an invasion, and they're completely in sync with that. In fact, it's their creation, it's the mega creation, the anti-immigration
mm.
war.
That's right.
I wanted to ask you a little bit, to explain to our audience how destabilizing this can be for West Asia. And I'm asking this because quite often Americans don't have any sense of what the Middle East is. And very few people understood that there would be an insurgency against the United States in Iraq after the Americans walked in without a fight and removed Saddam Hussein. And the whole history of ISIS and Al Qaeda, no one predicted, because apparently a lot of officials didn't even know that there existed Shia and Sunni. And what we are treading is, it's a very dangerous ground, because even the bases in Syria, for instance, the Khashoggi bases, there are bases all around the West Asia, and they are on high alert. If Iran is forced to retaliate, these nations are not very friendly. and it can spill over, and they have very complex demographics. There are many groups, not everyone like each other. The governments are not very stable. They have been destabilized very recently. If you could give us a sense of what stake do we have in West Asia in escalating this conflict?
Well, there's several issues here. First of all, Iran is much more powerful than was Iraq. Iran is much larger geographically than Iraq. Iran has a much larger population than does Iraq, and I suspect many of your viewers will have seen that snippet from the
Ted
Tucker
Cruz.
Carlson interview with Ted Cruz, and will have learned that Iran has a population of over 90 million people. About about half of Iran's population, or slightly more than half, are ethnic Persians, and the other half are divided between a whole variety of minorities: Azeris, Kurds, Arabs, Baluchis, and so on. Now, that doesn't mean that people who belong to a certain religious sect or ethnic group have their primary loyalties to that sector group. That's a mistake that's routinely made. The supreme leader of Iran, Khamenei, is, I believe, Azeri, and Iran's current president, Pezeshkian, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is Kurdish. So the idea that, because you're a Kurd or an Arab or whatever, and a Sunni or a Shiite, that therefore that determines your loyalty in your politics, I think is a mistake that is all too often made by people who don't understand the region, and a mistake that's made at their not only at their own peril, but has catastrophic repercussions in the Middle East. I mean, just look at Iraq and the CPA, which sought to organize. It was a coalition provisional authority, the first post-war government established by the Americans at the beginning of their occupation in 2003, where they, for the first time in Iraqi history, cabinet posts were apportioned on the basis of the ethnicity or religious affiliation of its members. But we're the ones who are sectarian, not the Americans. Um, and secondly, Iran sits at a critical geographical position, not only in the Persian Gulf, but also regarding South Asia. It borders also Pakistan. It has, from my understanding, quite close relations with India as well. And Iran, therefore, is already in two regions with three nuclear powers. We keep talking about Israel, but of course, India and Pakistan to its east are nuclear powers as well. Now, as we've seen with today's attacks on the U.S. base in Qatar, and if I heard the news correctly before we started speaking, on U.S. bases in Iraq as well, and particularly if these expand, this could become a conflict that sets the entire region aflame. How, if and how, of course, remains to be seen. But let's look at Iraq. You know, after the Ba'athist regime in Iraq was overthrown, an insurgency developed in Iraq. That insurgency eventually extended into Saudi Arabia, Al-Qaeda insurgency in Saudi Arabia. It extended to a certain extent into Iran as well. And then after 2011, it extended into Syria. And, the emergence of ISIS and its so-called caliphate and its genocidal rule and so on cannot be understood without primary reference to the illegal invasion and occupation and destruction of Iraq and its society in 2003. There's an absolutely organic connection between the regime change initiative in Iraq, which, not forget, was supposed to be a cakewalk, and a decade later, the emergence of ISIS. I mean, people often expect that there are instant, immediate repercussions. That's usually not the way the world works. These things take time to germinate and develop and so on. But they absolutely do materialize sooner rather than later. So again, you know, um, since we're in the very midst, perhaps at the beginning, perhaps closer to the end of this war, it's very difficult, of course, to predict with any precision what and where its regional repercussions will be. But we can be absolutely certain that these will be coming, and they will be more serious and more consequential the longer this conflict persists, both for Iran and its society and for the region as a whole.
Yes, I wanted you to tell us about this because quite often than not, the stakes are never warned about. And we are literally talking about taking a cue from Iraq, millions of people, not
Often,
even 10.
often by the exact same people who were promoting the Iraq war to us
Exactly.
25 years ago and assuring us that we had absolutely nothing to be worried about and that the only reason we could possibly oppose a war against Iraq was because we were loyal to Saddam Hussein and Baathists.
And they're using the same playbook. The New York
Yep.
Times is running human rights reports about Iraq prison system in Iran, where dissidents are captured. Israel is now bombing it as if there are no prisons elsewhere. And the timing is very important. So anyway, I have two quick questions. So adjust your time depending on how busy you are. Um, Talking about regime change, I had Ambassador Chas Freeman on my show, and he said that a regime change might happen, but it's not where
Mhm.
people are talking about. And he thinks that a regime change might end up happening in Israel. Uh,
Hmm.
what's your sense of that statement?
I don't know if by regime change he meant Netanyahu being
All of
replaced with
yes,
something
yes,
more
yes.
fundamental.
No, I guess he says Netanyahu's fall. His explanation was that Israeli society has become extremely divisive. Um, um, Even though for now the war has meant that everyone is rallying behind the flag,
Mhm.
but underneath that the divisions are extremely striking. That's what
Yes.
he meant.
Well, I completely see his point. The point I would make is that I think Israel has now become dependent on warfare. And it's true that warfare, permanent war, serves Netanyahu's personal interests. But I don't think that Israel's permanent state of warfare is dictated by Netanyahu's personal interests. Because if it was, we would have to believe that this entire society, its entire political class, its entire military leadership, its entire security leadership, are being willfully dragged along against their will into this years long project that is leading to Israeli cities being bombed by heavy missiles, casualties, and all the rest of it, in the full knowledge that the only reason they're doing this is to serve a leader who they could very easily replace. I don't buy that. I think it reflects increasingly the ideological basis of the state, and it reflects kind of the need by the state to fundamentally reshape the security environment of an entire region in order to dominate it for a generation, and a conviction that it can succeed. In other words, it's being dictated by strategic motives, political motives, and so on. And to a certain extent, I'm sure, also by decisions the leader is able to take in his own interest, but because they coincide with these larger motives I just described. Um, It has been a given, and I think this is what Ambassador Freeman was the point he was making. It has been a given that the moment Israel is forced to stop, meaning it gets a phone call from Washington, that then all these contradictions will bubble to the surface, and Netanyahu's days as prime minister are numbered. I suspect that's true. It would have been much more true a year or two ago. To what extent it remains as applicable in the current environment where Israel is so polarized that one can see the current government taking radical measures to remain in power and succeeding in doing so. That's an open question, but I think the premise is a fairly sound one.
My final question is both a fun question but also serious question. You uploaded a video of Destiny giving sermons
Oh God.
to people to be inducted in the IDF, I assume. If you could tell us what that was about. And I'm asking this to, apart from bringing in a little bit humor in this
Mm.
not so good
Yes,
times, to not forget Palestine and what is going on there, because a significant part of the escalation of the war is to deflect attention at a time when even Europeans were had started to become critical about Netanyahu's attempt of ethnic cleansing, and I
yes,
think he's been succeeding now because a lot of attention has been diverted. So end by
yes.
updating us on Palestine.
Yeah. Well, thank you for asking about that, and allow me to slightly disagree with you, because I do not think that diverting and deflecting attention from Palestine, particularly from the genocide in the Gaza Strip, was an important motive for Israel in attacking Iran. Um, the purpose was to maintain Israel's nuclear monopoly, and the purpose was to reshape the strategic environment of the Middle East. And the timing was dictated by the need to derail U.S. Iranian diplomacy before it succeeded. As for Gaza, the reason I'm not convinced that this was a war to divert from another war is that, yes, you're right. You know, we began to see significant statements from Europe. You know, the Brits suspending negotiations for a free trade agreement with Israel, the Brits sanctioning two senior Israeli government ministers and making it very clear that these sanctions were imposed because of what these ministers were saying rather than what they were doing.
Mm.
The European Union launching a review of Article 2 of its association agreement with Israel, basically, to put it simply, uh, conducting a review to determine whether Israel is fulfilling its human rights obligations that entitle it to various trade and other privileges in the European Union, or whether that agreement should be suspended. Now, I'm not going to dismiss these measures out of hand. I'm not going to say they're meaningless and insignificant, but these measures were themselves kind of a diversion. I mean, when the Brits um, sanction two ministers because of what they say rather than because of the policies they implement, um, it crosses a threshold, but it also raises questions. Why aren't you sanctioning the policies? Given that they work for someone who's a international fugitive from justice because he's an indicted war criminal, why didn't you have anything to say about him? Why nothing about the state that is implementing all the policies that you say to be concerned about?
Mm.
Why are you still delivering arms to Israel? Why are you still conducting intelligence overflights on a regular basis over the Gaza Strip to deliver vital information to the Israeli military so that it can more effectively perpetrate a genocide? And similarly, for the Europeans, you know, this association agreement is 25 years old. Settlement expansion has been going on from the moment the ink dried on that agreement. Um, uh, there have been all kinds of human rights violations that have been thoroughly documented. It's an apartheid state, and everyone knows it, and everyone has documented it. Are you really trying to convince me that for 25 years you weren't able to determine whether or not Israel was in fulfillment or violation of its human rights obligations? And if for the past 25 years you hadn't had a clue, how are you suddenly going to figure it out now? Are we really supposed to take you seriously that you're considering suspending this agreement or even parts of this agreement in response to genocide when you have systematically pretended apartheid doesn't exist, torture doesn't exist, like settlement expansion doesn't exist, and so on? So, without taking too much of your time, the point I'm trying to make is there really wasn't that much
Mhm.
pressure that required Israel to divert attention from. Impunity remained a central pillar of Western foreign policy. Israeli impunity remained a central pillar of Western foreign policy. There was absolutely no risk of any kinds of measures that could have threatened Israel's ability to continue with its genocide or have to put an end to its military effort. And so, yes, the war has had the added benefit of diverting attention from Palestine, and particularly from the genocide in the Gaza Strip. But that was not so much a motive as a collateral benefit, if you will. And of course, in the meantime, we're still seeing these daily horrific massacres at these kill zones designed for Israel by the Boston Consulting Group and being managed by the Gaza Holocaust Foundation, in which dozens of people are being deliberately mowed down every day for no other reason that they're so desperate. They're trying to get into these kill zones to access relief as part of a plan by Israel designed for by the Boston Consulting Group, which needs to be said every time this is mentioned, to wipe out the international, to displace and replace the international aid organizations, the UN and others, so that Israel can seize full control of vital supplies required for life and weaponize them and use them to wipe out life. Regarding Destiny, who some people have said should now be renamed Complicity. I mean, imagine, the guy is explaining to Israeli soldiers, if you're going to engage in war crimes, if you're going to dress up in the lingerie of women whose houses you've ransacked and who you've perhaps killed and so on, if you think it's fine to do that, I'm not telling you not to do it. I'm just telling you don't put it on video. And now a video emerges of him making the statement. So imagine how staggeringly idiotic you have to be to allow a video to be taken of yourself telling others, not, as Norman Finkelstein rightly called him, a fantastic moron.
I completely agree with your assessment of the European their complicity, basically, that there was no real fundamental change. But I think if preserving the nuclear monopoly was the only factor, then logically speaking, letting the negotiations happen is the best deal, because Netanyahu knows it as much as anyone knows it, that if you make the deal, which was the JCPOA deal, or any other deal that was being negotiated, that means that Iran is out of nuclear weapon. The
Yes.
only thing that comes to my mind is that there must be an element of the Palestinian movement and the axis of resistance for Israel to feel that breaking up Iran, not just maybe regime change, but even breaking up Iran
Yes.
is absolutely essential, which is in the same line of the spirit of Camp David, basically delinking the Arab nationalism as it was done in the case of Egypt and then in Jordan and so on and so forth. Iran is complicated, so break up Iran. And that was my
Well,
assessment.
fair point, and quite a few analysts who know Iran much better than I do have suggested that Israel's objective, in fact, transcends regime change and is properly identified as state collapse. So I think you raise a valid point there. Regarding the weapons, I wasn't suggesting this was Israel's only motive. I was saying it was a primary motive, and I should have perhaps clarified a bit that from Israel's perspective, maintaining its nuclear monopoly, as we saw with its attack on Iraq in 1981 and on Syria in 2007, does not just mean ensuring no other state develops a nuclear weapon, even though Iran wasn't, that was a charge that was being made, but also ensuring that no other state in the region has the capacity to develop a nuclear weapon. And we certainly saw this, for example, with the systematic assassination of many scientists in Iraq
Mhm.
after 2003. And if I'm right on that, I think it nicely complements the point you just made about pursuing a policy of state collapse in Iran.
We'll leave it there, Moin. Thank you so much. This was a very helpful conversation.
Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.